Hello from colorful Colorado Art of Education Winter Conference. My name is Andrea Slusarski and I'm so excited to be back presenting, and it's not just because winter is my favorite season in the Rockies, but it's also because I'm going to be showing you how to take my own artistic practice of plein air painting and how I transfer that into the classroom to help my students understand watercolor landscapes better. This presentation is going to be broken up into two parts, but before we head back to the classroom, let's go see some plein air painting in action. Now that we found a great place to start, let's first break down what plein air painting is for those of you who may not know about it yet. Plein air painting is a French phrase meaning open air, or simply put, plein air painting is painting outdoors. Now, traditionally, this breaks away from what you might teach in your classroom. However, I like to use plein air painting as more of an exercise in my classroom to help my students get excited about landscapes and to also loosen up with their painting. Using plein air painting techniques teaches your students two very key lessons in their way to becoming painters. The first is to look at the space that you're drawing. Now, obviously, getting a classroom of students out to the mountains in a 55-minute class period is really hard to pull off. I can't even do it teaching in Colorado. However, what you can do is take your students to a new open space outside of your classroom. This is going to teach them to look at the space, look at their surroundings, and be able to transfer that into their painting. Now, for the first step, I allow my students 5 minutes to lightly pencil sketch in areas of key importance, maybe like the horizon line, any key areas, and then we put our pencils away. Now, the second lesson of plein air painting is to start painting. So many times my students are struggling to get paint onto their canvases. There's this fear of messing up. But after my best Bob Ross impersonation that we don't make mistakes, just happy accidents, I tell my students to put their pencils away. It's just brushes and paint from here on out. The whole act of plein air painting is to be painting while you are experiencing the outdoors or in the moment. So exercises like this are really great for students to loosen up a little bit with their painting and let go of those fears of making a mistake. When I'm outside, I like to use these watercolor brushes. They actually hold the water in the paintbrush. It's not only better for the environment, but it also makes this quick process of plein air painting easier. When we head back to the classroom, I'll talk about different types of watercolors and brushes that you can use with your students, but every time I bust these out with my students, they really, really enjoy them. Now, for the last bit of the watercolor painting outdoors, I have students either go in with darker watercolors or pens to add some more details to really pull out that depth in their landscapes. This is also a really great exercise for students developing their own style as a painter or adding anything to kind of make it their own. But it's getting a little cold out here, and let's head back to the classroom where we can talk about different watercolors, different classroom techniques that are going to help your students expand landscape painting even further. What you saw in the plein air painting exercise that we just did outside is basically all I do with my students. The whole goal of that exercise is to get students looking at landscapes and to starting to understand their watercolor medium a little bit better. But when we get back to the classroom, now it's time to get to business. This way we build up eventually to students creating their very own watercolor landscape final paintings. There are two types of watercolor paints you could be using with your students in your classroom. There's the more traditional cake variety, which I personally like using more in my own practice practice. And then there's also the liquid tube watercolors. I find that the liquid tube colors are better for students when they're beginning painting because they're easier to mix, and you also, for the price value, get a lot of options for your colors. So I would definitely recommend that one in your classroom. The other little piece that I like to include with my students is using watercolor pencils. These definitely help with students who are struggling with the paintbrushes and the paint at the beginning, and they're also really great for honing in on some details. Lastly, you want to have your students set up a nice set of flat and round brushes, water cup, paper towels, and their paper, and I typically tell them to make sure that they masking tape it down. This makes sure it doesn't curl up on them while they're working. Once we get back into the classroom, that's when we can start talking about the formal characteristics of a landscape painting. Now, I always love joking around about these definitions with my students because they're pretty simple. And simply put, we want to start with some sort of horizon line. So that area where the sky meets the ground, an area at the bottom of your paper or the front, or what artists like to call the foreground. And then, after a couple little jokes, we talk about the middle ground being conveniently placed in the middle of our drawing and our background being placed in the back. Now, with these terms, as simple as they are, they really teach us a lot about how to create depth in our watercolor landscapes, meaning that when objects are in our foreground, they're going to be bigger and they're going to have more details. So, as a general rule, when you're moving back towards the background in your landscape drawing, things are going to get smaller. Their details are also going to go away, and their colors are also going to dull out and blue because of atmospheric perspective. Now, naturally, your students probably already put these terms into their paintings, and busting out their plein air paintings from their exercise is a great way to have them label what they already naturally drew with the formal characteristics. Next, just like the exercise, we begin building up the painting, starting with the background and working your way closer to the viewer. I always have students paint their backgrounds first and then continue moving forward. This ensures that they not only have overlapping in their painting, but they're also building up kind of the darkness of their watercolors to create that foreground detail and push forward. When you notice students struggling with this part in your classroom, just bring them back to the freedom that they had in their plein air, and that will kind of remind them about just seeing the space and creating that depth without having to get too hung up in all of this. Now, sometimes the watercolors will have a mind of their own, and so, pun intended, just let them go with the flow when they start painting them. Thank you so much for joining me on a plein air paint and hike and the quick classroom here today. The handout I've included with this video is full of tons of examples, lessons, rubrics, you name it, go check it out. I really hope this video helps you bring plein air painting techniques into your classroom to not only enhance your students' knowledge of watercolors, but also landscapes. Thank you.